Thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar on the Board and CEO Partnership, being recorded for the Wisconsin Resource Center for Charter Schools by Board on Track. Before we get into things, let me introduce myself. My name is Mike Mizoni. I am Director of Leadership and Governance Training for Board on Track. We're really excited to be able to offer this information for you because this Board CEO Partnership is one of the things that's critical to having success as a charter organization, and it's one of the things that unfortunately most boards do not put too much focus into actually getting right. And so we're going to try and put some intentionality in our efforts to have a really strong and value-added Board CEO Partnership. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to start by briefly defining the partnership, why it's important, what it looks like. Then we're going to spend some time doing an overview of what some of the common obstacles are to a strong partnership. With our work with over 500 charter schools across the country, we have some real great expertise in what sometimes leads to the breakdown of this relationship. We're going to talk about how you strengthen that partnership, including the use of an annual CEO evaluation and a mid-year check-in to strengthen that partnership, like I said, between the board and the CEO. And then lastly, we're going to talk about this thing called the governance and management line. Some people call it governance versus management. We try very purposefully not to call it that because it really should be a collaboration and a partnership. So we're going to really focus in and then let you do some exercises on your own that get to understanding what the governance management line should be for your organization and how to handle issues that arise that might be unclear. All right, so let's just jump into it. Why is this important? It's important because this stuff matters. Down here at the bottom in orange, these are some of the really great inputs that any charter school relies on. You've got your staff, a really strong, committed faculty and staff. You've got a curriculum that may be a unique pedagogy or methodology that you've developed for your school. We've got money, we've got financial investments, and we've got stakeholders. We've got the community, we've got your students, your faculty, your staff, and the tax base, the larger tax base. Really what we look for is when you have what you get in blue here, a self-sustaining board that has a really strong partnership with the CEO. That allows the organization, when you get to this stuff in green and above, which tends to be the vision of excellence for most charter organizations, which is either or both organizational sustainability and growth and replication of their organization. So again, what we're really focusing in on is the blue level here, which is having a strong governing board, a really strong CEO, and what the partnership looks like between those two. That's what we're going to try and get right today, because when you get all those great inputs down below in orange and they get funneled up through that partnership, that's what allows great schools to exist. So again, that's what we're going to focus on today is this blue piece right here. So how important is a board to a charter school's success? Really, charter school boards are critical to getting this organization correct and having it done successfully. So like I said here, it can be argued that the ultimate success of a charter school hinges on the board's ability to govern effectively. From our experience, virtually all charter school organizations that close for some reason that can be traced back to either an action or inaction by the board. And like we've said before, really the board's work relies upon this strong partnership with the CEO. So really critical things about the board's role with the organization is that they select, support, and ultimately, when necessary, terminates the CEO. So you often hear this notion that the board is the boss of the CEO. And while it's more nuanced than that, so we don't really like to, we don't subscribe necessarily to that exact model. There's a lot of truth to that. Ultimately, this individual is hired by the board, and ultimately, if the need arises, they can be removed by the board. It's also really important, though, that they ensure that the organization is operationally and financially viable. So keeping and monitoring and providing financial oversight over the books and making sure that fundamentally that the lights are kept on and that there's a budget that is sustainable for the organization. The board then partners with the CEO to define and ensure delivery of what we call the vision of academic excellence. So this is gets to the heart of why the organization exists and usually ties directly to your charter promises. But these are the things that you need to get right as an organization. This is why your school exists. What does academic excellence look like to us? And what commitments have we made to our authorizer that we need to accomplish as part of that contract? So really, it comes down to that the board and the CEO partnership is everything, because as we'll get into, there really is differing role between what the board does and what the CEO does, and we want to make sure that we get that right. Because if you don't have a strong partnership between the board and the CEO, it is going to be impossible to govern effectively. And if both ends are pulling in different directions, we're not going to be able to get anywhere. So let's go ahead and define this board-CEO partnership. Big picture, the board and CEO relationship should feel like a partnership. It should feel like both parties, that their workload is really being undertaken by teamwork. So that the CEO feels like they've got a lot of clear, measurable goals and outcomes that they're going to be held accountable to, and that they know that the board is there as somebody that he or she can rely upon to support that work, to provide sufficient resources, to help set the right direction. And then on the flip side of that, boards, really strong governing boards, rely on this partnership with the CEO. Any good governing board is going to have their CEO as a true chief executive officer. So that person's job is there to support the board as well. So you'll see how that overlaps. Quick teaser would be something like the board budget process. So very often we would expect the CEO of the organization to actually draft an initial budget, and then they work back with the finance committee and the full board to iterate and ultimately approve that budget. So a great board, in order to get really great work done, really relies on that CEO. So the workload really should feel like a partnership and feel like teamwork. The board and the CEO should have a shared and articulable vision of excellence and clarity about what the steps are that the board and the CEO need to take to get closer to that vision of excellence year over year. That's typically something that you would see happening at a summer board retreat, maybe as part of the CEO evaluation or some other planning process where the board and the CEO are aligned on not only what the vision of excellence is, but what they're going to do this year to get closer to that vision of excellence. This can look different for every organization. You might have an organization that's been around for a few years and is established, and their vision of excellence includes growth and replication. So there might include some goals this year on not only maintaining the organization that we have, but also talking about planning a new school for the future. It could also be more simple than that. If you're a brand new school, your vision of excellence could look much more simple, about getting a really successful school off the ground running and having a really strong year. But it's important, whatever that vision is, that the board knows what it is, the CEO knows what it is, and there's clear steps to get there. A little exercise that I love to take is, if you can't answer that question right now and be able to write it down, what the vision of excellence is, and have it look substantially similar to the rest of your team, then I would make sure that you pause your work and undertake that effort to actually draft and get aligned on what really is our vision of excellence and how are we going to get there. It's critical that this partnership is built on mutual trust and respect. We're going to see why this is the case, but again, it all goes back to this being a true partnership, because the work of the board is depending on the CEO, and the work of the CEO depends upon the board. So you want this to be a partnership that lives in mutual trust and respect, because there's a lot of faith that the board puts in the CEO, that the CEO is now going to take that direction and go execute upon it. It's also really important here, however, that the board can trust the CEO will come to them when there are issues that arise that need their attention. So this whole partnership is going to rely upon trusting but verifying. So that'll be a constant theme, is that the board delegates and relies on the CEO, and then there's an element of accountability where the board will check in and hold the CEO accountable throughout the year to those agreed upon goals. So in order to be able to provide honest, constructive feedback throughout the year, you really want to make sure that there is trust and mutual respect here. We've seen this be one of the major pitfalls of this relationship is when it's not grounded in mutual trust and respect. You communicate effectively and efficiently. This gets to that point that I just said. Again, if you have a relationship where the board is not able to provide continuous or regular feedback to the CEO, that'll be a recipe for a breakdown in this partnership. So you want it to be really effective and efficient communication. And then that communication should really be focused on go to the heart of why we're here, which is results for students. So whenever, throughout the CEO evaluation process, throughout all of these communications and this work between the board and the CEO, everything at its heart should be focused and tied to getting results for students and for the organization. Because why is this so important? This part, when we're in person and we make this statement, we often see some realization and clarity wash over people's brains, which is that you are really collaborating to run a multi-million-dollar public enterprise with the professionalism, the skills, and temperament that's needed that you as the board are bringing to this organization. So really is it's really important to level set and to recognize that you as board members are really truly on the board of directors of a multi-million-dollar organization. So it's important to get this stuff right. It's a really important endeavor that you've taken on, and then this board CEO partnership gets right to the heart of that. So this is the big picture. This is what the board CEO partnership should look like. So to summarize, really the workload is divided so it feels like teamwork. There's a shared vision and clear understanding of what that vision is and how we're going to get there. The partnership is built on mutual trust, respect, and communication that is regular, effective, and efficient. The focus of all this effort between the board and the CEO is on results, and we are going to all bring our professionalism, skills, time, temperament to run and govern this multi-million-dollar enterprise. So if we know that that's the goal that we're looking for, right, we're trying to check all of those boxes, here's some common obstacles that we see that we think get to the heart of the breakdown between many of the partnerships that we see out there. All right, so the first one here is a lack of governance experience. This is one of those common obstacles to this board CEO partnership. So from the CEO's perspective, based on our work, the average charter school CEO doesn't actually have previous governance experience. So what do we mean by governance experience? We mean having experience serving and working alongside a governing board. Many of our school leaders, the CEOs, tend to either be principals or educators who come from the traditional school districts, or they may be someone who comes from another industry and has this really great idea to open the school. So what we find is it's not a problem, but it's not surprising that many of the charter school CEOs don't have previous governance experience, and they think it's, they, for whatever reason, whether it's naivete or just being unprepared, they're not prepared for the role of supporting, fostering this board work, and then also understanding how that board's oversight and the governing responsibilities overlap with their work as the CEO. So we often see that lack of governance experience from the CEO and then also from the board. Many board members join this charter school board as the first time that they've served as a volunteer board member. So we see this a lot. That's why it's really important to be doing what you're doing today, which is to be learning and developing as an individual. So you're upping what we would call your governance game by getting experience. Governance, and especially with board governance, we say it a lot here at Board on Track that it is definitely a skill that nobody is born with, but that is relatively easy to develop over time if you focus on it. So the things that, understanding what the role is of a board member and how to add value and how to be a strong board member are things that you develop over time. Same goes for the CEO. That is definitely the not having charter school board experience is something that a CEO who's committed to developing that area of their expertise can do so relatively easily. So another big problem here is that there's a disconnect or lack of clarity as to how the board is going to add value to the organization. One thing we see here is that the CEO sees the board as taking away from their important job of running the organization. They see this as something that, the board gets in their way. They're trying to get really great work done, but now they've got to go to this board meeting or prepare for this board meeting. And the board meddles in their affairs. That is a huge mistake to go into this partnership with that kind of attitude. That kind of attitude tells me that there's a fundamental misunderstanding as to the role of and purpose of both the CEO and the board. So we're going to try and uncover that. And then on the flip side of that, one of the reasons why it may feel that way to the CEO is if the board doesn't actually have clear goals of their own that they are responsible for contributing and moving forward with. So that's one of the things that we're going to look towards is making sure that the board has a direction of its own so that it understands how it's going to add value and that the CEO understands and is aligned with that. So when we talk about faulty expectations, like I said, we're really making sure that the CEO understands that in order, going back to that very first slide I had where we're understanding the importance of the CEO board partnership, really understanding and mastering that partnership is going to open doors to that vision of success. So we want to make sure that the CEO understands their role as a chief executive for this organization and how what part of that job responsibility includes supporting and working with the board. So what do you mean it's a partnership? The CEO says, they're my bosses. It's not a partnership. Or sometimes in the alternative, we hear, this is my school. I'm the founder. It was my great idea. It's not a partnership. This is my organization to run. Vice versa, the CEO, the board sometimes says, we are the boss. The CEO reports to us. We are in charge. This is not a partnership. Again, these themes get to a fundamental misunderstanding of what the relationship is between the board and the CEO. Really, it's critical that the CEO understands that there is an element of, regardless of whether you are the founding CEO or if you've been brought in to the organization, that this is a public organization and that there is a public framework within that, which includes governance by what we would call a lay board made up of volunteers. Similarly, the board needs to understand what their role is, and we're going to get into this more today, that the difference between being a governing board and running the organization. So again, having that fundamental misunderstanding of what this relationship is will often lead to this breakdown. It's a common obstacle we see. The CEO's attitude and expectations. We often hear CEOs say that the board should just do their work. I wish that they would do more. Very often say, I wish that they would do less and stay out of my business, or they just don't get it. I'm trying to run this organization and they don't understand what I'm trying to get done. So what I'd like to remind here is that constant care and attention by the CEO is key to effective governance. It is on you, the CEO, to help the board do the job that you need them to do. Board governance from any sector, whether it's a corporate board, a charitable board, a hospital board, or this charter school board. It's a very unique relationship where the CEO gets hired, gets evaluated, gets support from the board, but then also in return, the CEO is really responsible for putting effort into supporting the work of the board as well. So a lot of the organizing efforts come from the board, come from the CEO. So this piece here is really important, which is that the CEO needs to help the board to do the job that the CEO needs them to do. It's a little bit of a backwards thinking there. From the board's perspective with attitude and expectations, it's critical for board members to remember that they have hired this CEO because they are a talented, skilled professional who is capable of doing the work that they've been hired to do. So it's important that you give them the respect that they deserve. It's important that the board understands how to add value at a strategic governance level rather than a management level. This gets to the heart of the notion of the governance management line that we're going to get into in just a bit, understanding what lane to stay in and how to maximize your value add in that lane. And, and then lastly here, having an understanding of what the CEO thinks are the most important things the board could do to add value this year. Do you agree with them? Do you disagree with them? This is a really great exercise for boards to do, like I said, typically at a summer board retreat or at your other really in-depth planning and strategy session, is to ask yourself and the CEO, where are we heading as an organization? What is our vision of excellence? What needs to get done this year to contribute to that vision of excellence? And what of those things are the responsibility of the board? What of those things are the responsibility of the CEO? And what areas are there overlap? And there's going to be dual function, say, for example, the budget. The budget is a great example of where there's overlap between the board and the CEO. All right, so now we've got an understanding of what the board CEO partnership should look like, some of the key attributes, right? Getting to communication built on trust, mutual respect, clear understanding of the vision and the steps to get there. We've seen some of the mistakes that are common obstacles to this relationship. Again, you'll note that many of them come back to this fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship. Sometimes it is the CEO says the board needs to stay out of my way, or the board needs to do a lot more work. Really, I'm doing it all on my own. From the board's perspective, they may say the CEO is not doing things the right way. We want to get more involved. There's fundamental misunderstanding of what that relationship looks like. From lack of experience, not knowing what a governing board does, not knowing what a CEO of a public entity does, not having an understanding of getting a commitment to shared vision and those steps to get there, how they're going to add value. All right, so let's talk about now some keys to strengthening that partnership. So right off the bat, it's important to highlight from the top of the organizational structure, for the board is the board chair. So what we'll find is that the board chair and the CEO of your organization are going to have a unique partnership because they will work so closely together. The board chair has no more power or responsibility or no more of a vote than other board members, but they really are there to lead and organize the board's work. So you'll often find that the board chair and the CEO are going to talk much more frequently than the CEO and other board members. Very often we see at least a weekly phone call between the board chair and the CEO. Oftentimes we see a weekly in-person meeting. There's definitely there's wide variation in what this relationship looks like, but it's going to be a unique relationship between the board chair and the CEO. It's important to note that the board chair is not the CEO's boss. The CEO reports to the full board. Just like the board chair is not in charge of the board, they're the leader for the board. The CEO does not work directly for the chair. The CEO reports to the full board. So that's an important thing to get off right from the get-go, because that's something that can be a mistake in a misalignment that we see as well, is that the board chair, the CEO defers too heavily to the board chair because of the special relationship. It is important to note that there needs to be a strong partnership with the board chair and CEO because of all those things that I just talked about. The board chair and the CEO talk much more frequently to plan the board's efforts, and they just have a much more stronger partnership when they're interacting so often, and the work of the board and the organization depends on that sort of regular communication. So if this partnership goes well, we like to point out here that there's totally nothing wrong with your CEO making recommendations to the board as to who the next chair should be. Because again, the board chair and the CEO styles should complement one another, because they're, like I said, it's this unique partnership. Things like planning board retreats, talking about what the agenda is going to look like, helping to set sort of the direction of the board and what work the board's going to undertake and when. A lot of this stuff will be planned by the board chair and the CEO. So you want this relationship to be a really strong one. Again, all of those same attributes that apply to the full board's relationship with the CEO, built on mutual trust and respect, effective and efficient communication, all of those things apply to the board chair themselves and the CEO. So while it's not the CEO's job to select the board chair, that's really the board's function. would definitely consider, if you've got a healthy relationship demonstrated in the past, there's nothing wrong with having the CEO make a recommendation as to who they think will make the strongest partnership between the board chair and the CEO. All right, the next thing here is to make sure that you have a plan to supporting and evaluating your CEO. A really great board CEO partnership is going to rely on not only evaluating and holding your CEO accountable, but also supporting them throughout the year. That all starts with clear expectations. Clear expectations about the role of the CEO and how that position is expected to add value to the organization. So the first thing here is the job description. Making sure that the board has approved the job description. Again, since they are the ones who hire and evaluate this person, it's clear that they understand the expectations for the position. Important for that job description to be reviewed periodically, typically as part of the CEO evaluation process. You want to make sure you have board-approved annual goals. Why is this important? Because, again, this gets to the heart of the alignment between the board's vision and the CEO's vision and what those steps are that we're taking this year to move forward. So oftentimes what we'll find is that the CEO will draft a set of goals for the year based on their understanding of the vision. Then there would be a meeting between the board and the CEO where they discuss those goals, and then they're ultimately approved by the full board. This ensures that the board and the CEO are pointed in the same direction and understand the steps that each party is going to take to further them. The board themselves will then have a separate set of goals for what the board is going to do throughout that year and how they're going to hold themselves accountable. And you'll definitely see some parallels between those two sets of goals. Oftentimes, one or more of the CEO's goals will depend upon and overlap with the board's goals. So going back to our example of growth and replication, if our goal this year is to expand to a new location, a lot of that work that the CEO is going to do with his or her team as to identifying a property for a new building and designing the building and getting it built and working with contractors, a lot of that work will overlap with the board. So it's important to spell that out, including board-approved performance metrics, so that come the evaluation time in the spring or summer, there's no surprise between the board and the CEO as to what those metrics are going to look like. Throughout the year, we're looking for effective and thorough support being provided to the CEO. So we're going to look for a clear and consistent process. This is something that we recommend that's actually documented and agreed upon between the board and the CEO. What is this relationship going to look like for the year ahead? What touch points will there be for me and the board for mid-year check-ins? When is there going to be a full formal evaluation? And what is it that I am going to be evaluated upon during that formal evaluation? So one of the things we like to flag here down at the bottom, which is about using a nationally proven charter school tool, is that your charter school organizations are inherently innovative and creative entities. They are entrepreneurial by nature because somebody had a brilliant idea to actually take a charter school idea out of their brain, out of thin air, and actually establish it in front of them. One of the areas where you do not need to worry about using those creative juices is when it comes to this board governance work and the relationship between the CEO. There are plenty of exemplars out there for how to evaluate the CEO. We're going to talk about board on tracks methodology and process in just a moment, but you should know that you do not need to reinvent the wheel here. There are resources out there that you can use and apply them to your organization. So what does this annual CEO evaluation look like? The key here is to understand that this should be part of a cycle of documenting goals or job expectations, doing a mid-year check-in, evaluating on them, evaluating the CEO on those goals, documenting new goals for the next year, doing a check-in, supporting the CEO, evaluating the CEO on those goals, and again it becomes a cycle. So if you look at the top of this cycle here, it says documentation. This is either the contract, the job description when the CEO is first hired, or a board-approved memo that outlines annual goals. This is the culmination of the annual CEO evaluation will be a memo that summarizes the evaluation and documents your goals for next year. That's the real value of doing a CEO evaluation. There's a common misconception out there that CEO evaluations are somehow punitive or negative and are designed just to highlight areas of improvement for the CEO, but that's really a misunderstanding. The purpose of a CEO evaluation is really about strengthening the organization for the year going forward. So our goal really here, when we talk about a strong CEO evaluation, is actually to not focus on too much on the rearview mirror. Obviously, inherently on evaluating somebody is you have to focus on what happened last year, but our goal of doing so is really to influence next year and to approve for next year. So what we'll see here is up at the top, you've got your what the board goals are for the year. Going around to the clockwise, we've got a defined process. So we've got an appointed CEO support and evaluation committee. We're going to do mid-year check-ins. Sometimes we see a fall check-in and a spring check-in. Some people do a winter mid-year check-in. But it's important that at these check-ins, this is really where the support aspect comes in of CEO support and evaluation. So once you've got the documented goals up at the top, you're going to spend the rest of the year having a committee, the CEO Support and Evaluation Committee, that actually meets monthly with the CEO and reviews the progress that's being made towards those annual CEO goals. It's important for this committee to hear from the CEO what's working, what's maybe not working, what areas could the board provide more support for the CEO. One area that might come up would be an example of mid-year. We find that the board is going to be asked to allocate more resources, say, for a new math intervention specialist. That's the type of thing where the CEO needs that support of the board. This is an opportunity for this committee to vet the recommendation and actually elevate it to the full board. It's really important to have these mid-year check-ins so that there are no surprises come the end of the year and during the evaluation process. So that's really important here to note that there's the documented goals, there's support and check-ins throughout the year, and then it all ends in the spring or early summer with an annual CEO evaluation. So what we see here, board on tracks methodology is what's known as a modified 360. So we see this starts with a CEO's self-evaluation, where they're actually going through and answering questions about their own performance. Then they submit that to the board. The board conducts their evaluation of the CEO. And then one of the things that's included in this process as well that some people choose to do and some people choose not to is getting the input from direct reports. So some key direct reports we think is important because the board has a very small window into the work of the CEO day to day. The board members are not there every day in the school. They don't get to see how the school leader interacts with fellow staff members, with faculty, with students, with parents. So it's important to get some input from those direct reports, say the CFO, the chief academic officer, principals. Some key direct reports are important so that the board can really provide a thorough evaluation of the school leader. This annual CEO evaluation process ends with this documentation. So like I said, the real value of doing a CEO evaluation is not to dwell on things that happened in the past, but to reflect upon what happened in the past, use that information that we have to plan for the year ahead. So we like that evaluation to happen, and it's actually documented in a memo that outlines and summarizes the CEO evaluation. So it identifies who took part in the evaluation, what the process was, summarizes the overall evaluation, areas of improvement, areas of growth, and then ultimately at the bottom, the last part of the memo should include what the CEO's goals are going to be for the following year, again, to kick off this cycle of evaluation. So here are the key action steps. First and foremost, the first and most important thing is that the board forms what's known as a CEO Support and Evaluation Committee. This is something you just heard me mention a couple times. It's one of the things that boards get wrong most often when it comes to evaluating in supporting the CEO. First thing is that they forget that second half of it, the support part. They understand that they're the quote unquote bosses of the board. They know it's one of their key functions. It's often a requirement from authorizers that you evaluate your CEO, but boards often miss this support part. So oftentimes what we see is a CEO evaluation task force will pop up in March or April, and it lives for 90 days. They know they got to check the boxes. So they pop up, they set up the CEO evaluation, they run it, and then they disappear. We really like to see a support and evaluation committee, which is dedicated partially to that end of the year CEO evaluation. But more importantly for that, they're there to help the CEO be successful throughout the year. So you want to form this committee, recommend it that it includes the board chair on this committee, but that the board chair is not actually the chair of that committee. Why is that important? One, we've identified that the board chair and the CEO have a special partnership. The board chair is probably going to know the CEO better than any other board member. So it's important to have their perspective on the board. Recommend having a different board member actually be the board chair for the exact same reason, that the board chair and the CEO have a special partnership. So I think I just misspoke. So when I said it's really important for a board member to be the committee chair, rather than having the board chair lead that committee. So we want the perspective of the board chair on the committee. We want a different person running that committee just to have a little bit of checks and balances on that committee. Next, once you get that committee formed, you want to develop a timeline for what the evaluation process is going to look like. We recommend a 90-day process. We find that that's the right amount of time to do a robust and thorough evaluation and some planning for the future. That seems like a pretty safe timeline, but that can be adjusted based on your unique circumstances. Once you've got that timeline established, you're going to determine what the evaluation tool or instrument is going to look like. Which one are you going to use? Again, this is where I say, do not go out and reinvent the wheel. We've got plenty of examples at Board on Track, and there are others nationally. Here at Board on Track, we actually include within our suite of online tools, our dashboard, a specific CEO evaluation tool that walks you and your board through every step of the way. So identifying the CEO evaluation committee, opening the CEO evaluation, your board members click through and answer some questions along with the CEO and the direct reports, and then it actually creates a template memo that highlights the process, summarizes the evaluation, and allows you to input goals for next year. So once you've got the evaluation tool or instrument that you're going to use, first step in the actual evaluation itself is that the CEO completes their self-evaluation. Important that this is then shared with the entire board. Additionally, the board will get the direct reports evaluation. Again, if you use the Board on Track tool, if you become a member of Board on Track, this stuff will be automated for you, where your direct reports can go in and answer questions, and it automatically gets sent to the board. What's important here, though, is that the board has an opportunity to review the summary of that direct report evaluation. The board then conducts their evaluation. So they take in all of the data points that they have access to, the CEO's evaluation, the direct reports evaluation, any other data points that are out there, and the board conducts their formal evaluation of the CEO. Once that's done, once all the board members have an opportunity to weigh in, the CEO Support and Evaluation Committee is then going to take all that information, all of the board's data, so the board's evaluation of the CEO, and they're going to summarize it in a memo that they share to the CEO. So they're going to, like I said, outline the process that was undertaken, who took place in the evaluation, and what the evaluation results were. Next step is then that they actually have an in-person meeting with the CEO where they share the results, have an opportunity to discuss with the CEO what those results are, and provide an opportunity for the CEO to weigh in. And then they also discuss the full board. They discuss with the full board what those goals are going to be for next year. So based on the inputs that we got and the data that we have on what worked last year, what the CEO did well last year, and where there's areas for improvement, we're now going to say, given this, here are our goals for next year. We're going to discuss this all with the full board. So we're going to provide the full board with your summary of the evaluation. That includes, like I said, the areas that were good, the areas that need improvement, and then the board votes to approve the whole thing. So at the very end, most critical step is that the full board approves this document as an endorsement of the charge going forward for next year. That kicks off the process again for the following year. So if there was a step 11, it would be to kick off the process of supporting the CEO throughout the year. And then eventually you'd come back around to step 2 again, which would be developing your timeline for the next year. And this will then become a cycle that you'll become better at. It'll become more efficient, and it'll become more valuable for the organization. Similarly, one of the recommendations we make is that in addition to the formal end of the year CEO evaluation, that you consider doing a mid-year check-in as part of the efforts to strengthen this partnership as well. Not every board does a mid-year check-in. Some people find it overkill. What we will say is that based on our experience, really strong charter school leaders want to be evaluated. So oftentimes boards are hesitant to do the formal CEO evaluation or the mid-year check-in because they don't like to talk about the difficult things, to talk about the areas that need to be improved upon. But from our experience, really great charter school leaders really thrive on this feedback. They want to know what they're doing well. They want to know what areas they need to improve upon, and it doesn't need to be there doesn't need to be a negative association with that. So mid-year check-in to help strengthen the board CEO partnership. What is the purpose of a mid-year check-in? Going back to this notion of feedback being critical to us really strong charter school leaders who want to continuously to improve on their great work. Mid-year check-in is a great opportunity to provide exactly what it says, a check-in on the progress towards these goals mid-year. So it's a great way to ensure that the CEO is able to identify for the board what the key challenges they are facing. So the example I said a moment ago with the CEO evaluation, they might have a blocker where they need the board to redeploy some resources in a direction, maybe to hire a tutor or something like that. And so it's really great to have an opportunity to elevate issues to the full board that need their way in. So again, so that there are no surprises come the end of the year. It creates a structured time for the board to provide the CEO with feedback about the leadership, how the partnership is going with the board, and things that the board needs from the CEO. And lastly, create a structured time for the CEO to provide the board with feedback on the partnership itself. So things like communication protocols, any of that process type stuff, and how the board itself, how the board CEO partnership itself can be improved going forward. So what would this look like? Very similar to the end of the year CEO evaluation. So we're not going to go too much into it. You want to make sure you set dates and timeline. This would be done by the CEO Support and Evaluation Committee. If you want to do a mid-year check-in, you can do it in the winter, or think about doing it twice a year by doing one in the fall, late November, early December, and then another one in March. So similarly, you're going to form a CEO Support and Evaluation Committee, not task force. Likewise, should be comprised of 2 to 4 board members and include the board chair, just like before. Some things that you might want to consider for questions for this mid-year check-in would be things like, what do you think the CEO is doing exceptionally well this year? What could they be doing better? This is a great opportunity to reflect just as the board, to have a conversation with board members who maybe are not on that CEO Support and Evaluation Committee. Good thing for them to reflect. Things to ask of those goals that we set for the CEO at the beginning of the year. What's our progress towards them? Which ones do you feel confident you can achieve? Are there any that you're worried you may not be able to achieve? What steps need to be taken between now and the end of the year to realize that stuff? Is there any data that's concerning you? So things like test scores, monthly budgets to actuals, anything that needs to be raised for the board to hear. And then lastly, is there what could the board be doing? What could we be doing to support you better in your effort to achieve those goals for the year? So Mid-year check-in, again, not quite a formal end-of-the-year CEO evaluation, more of an opportunity to provide more less formal and informal conversation about progress towards goals, areas that need to be improved both from the board and the CEO. Some boards choose to do this in a less formal way, which would be to do the CEO evaluation committee meetings each month, and then as necessary to elevate strategic issues to the full board throughout the year. So now we're going to move on to the last topic here, which is the governance and management line. Reason why this is so important is because it's critical, again, to the work of the organization, and it gets to the heart of the overlapping nature of the relationship between the governing board and the managing CEO. So it's important to highlight when we get into talking about the governance management line that this is something that looks different for every organization in every period of time. Our goal here is just to find what is the right balance for your organization at this time. That's really what our focus is going to be. So in its biggest picture, boards govern and CEOs manage. That's the easy part. But what does that mean? So governance is all about planning, creating the framework, and providing oversight over the organization. Whereas management is all about executing and supporting that strategic direction, that vision. So in essence, boards provide leadership and strategy. They also provide oversight. They try to focus on the big picture and to stay away from day-to-day decision-making and execution. That's really going to be left up to the management team. A really interesting way to think about it when I try and really boil down to asking when you're presented with a decision and trying to focus on whether it's a decision for the board or for the CEO is to ask yourself, does this decision focus on, whenever we're making a decision, the board focuses on the results or the outcomes that are desired, and the CEOs focus on the means or the methods of accomplishing those goals. So stepping back, big picture, the board's role is to oversee this organization. They've hired this expert CEO who they are going to task with going and achieving their direction. So a sort of crude analogy here would be with a ship. You as the board have the charter for this ship. Nobody on the board is expected to be the one driving the ship. That's what you hire a captain for. So you all have decided to hire a captain. The board's role is to decide where we want to go. They point on a map, and then it's going to be the CEO's job to make sure that they hire the right crew and get the ship headed in the right direction. So let's dive in a little bit more on this, and then as part of this module, you will then have an opportunity to review some of these case studies and to identify how you would handle it with your board. So it's important to note here, and the reason why I like this statement down at the bottom that boards focus on results, CEOs focus on the means, is because it's very difficult to try and provide a black and white line for what is governance and what is management. It's one of these more nebulous type concepts that doesn't have a cut and dry answer because the governance management line is going to change and evolve over time depending on where your specific organization is. So the best we can do is to try and group these into different categories. So on the left in blue, here are some things that fall within the responsibility or the purview of the governing team, the board. So these are things like accountability, holding the CEO accountable, holding themselves as the board accountable, and really overall the accountability of the organization. They are fiduciaries of this public trust. So you as a board member are legally responsible for holding the charter and for holding the organization accountable. That's why we're going to do things like the annual CEO evaluation, which is going to be measuring and holding the CEO accountable to those charter promises. What progress are we delivering on our academic promises? Are students learning more than they did both the year before? Things like mission and culture. Again, they're in charge of the big picture of this organization, the strategic direction. So the core values of the organization, the mission of the organization, that's all going to be set by the board. They also set the policies in which all this great work is done. So they write policies for and it changes, but they're in charge of the policies such as a student handbook. They would approve that in line with their mission and culture. They might have a policy for evaluating teacher and staff performance each year, things like that. The policies in the framework that then the management team and the CEO work within. A big, huge thing here that's pretty cut and dry is allocating resources. So we talked about how the board ultimately approves the budget, again, being the fiduciaries of this public trust, the legally responsible party. Not only are they in charge of allocating the budget and approving the budget, but actually monitoring it throughout the year and providing financial oversight. On the other side in green, we've got things that are the management's team. So they execute on that vision. They take the mission and culture and then they execute it. So they are responsible if the board says, we really need to improve our math scores in this area. It's going to be the management team, the CEO's team, to develop the methodology and the tools that they're going to be used to do that. Operations of the school, day-to-day operations, that's totally within the scope of the CEO rather than the board. So, the board would never get involved with things like scheduling pickup and drop off at the school, for example. That's something that's going to be the CEO's job. Deploying those resources that the board allocates, that's something that's the CEO job. And then another thing that's pretty cut and dry here is staffing. In really just about any healthy organization, the board will hire and fire the CEO, who should be the head of the organizational chart. And then the CEO would hire everybody underneath that. So they would typically hire principals and work with the principals to hire individual school staff and teachers, things like that. So on the left, good way to summarize it is in the text in the white over there, is that all those things in blue are usually the board's decision, but of course, none of these decisions would happen without the CEO's advice. So everything on the left, the blue side, board's decision with the CEO's advice, and on the right-hand side in green, these things are the CEO's decision, ultimately, of course, with the board's advice and weigh in on that. All right. Of course, it's important to highlight that there are some things that are really inherent to this partnership. So the partnership itself is the responsibility of both parties. You've heard me say it a couple times on the webinar today, how it's the board's job to support and evaluate the CEO. It's the CEO's job to also support the work of the board there as well. So this partnership is a two-way street. That's an overlapping area. And then, of course, the strategic vision. So the board is really going to rely heavily on the CEO to provide that strategic vision. That really takes the mission and culture and expands it a little bit more into a 3 to 5 year plan with action steps. So just like going back to my crude ship analogy, we've pointed to where we want to go. Ultimately, the CEO, your captain here, is going to be involved with you in setting a vision for how we're going to get there. And then that ultimately will be approved by the board. So when you do your exercises on the governance management, consider how the governance management line might look similar or different based on your individual circumstances. Very normal, especially for founding boards and boards, say 5 years or younger, that the board's going to play a much more of a managerial feeling role. It's very normal for the board to roll up their sleeves and to get more in the weeds with things like financials and academic curriculum and things like that than when you're a well-established, well-run organization. At that point, we're going to expect to have much more of a robust staff, and the organization staff will take on a much larger role in management, and the governing team will really zoom out and focus on long-term strategy and planning. So think about how these things would be handled by your organization today and what the goal is for the future. So with that, that's the conclusion of the webinar for the CEO and board partnership. Important thing to remember here is that it really should be a true partnership. You want to try and foster this as a collaboration and not as a boss and employee type mentality. Really, the great work that you're doing, the vision of excellence, is going to be much more successful, and ultimately the outcomes we're looking for students will be much more successful if this partnership can thrive and be sustainable. So with that, thank you for watching.